My name is Madalna, and I was working in the marketing department when our paths crossed. Jacob worked in the sales department near my office. It all started quite innocently. We constantly bumped into each other in the office kitchen during lunch breaks. I warmed up my dreary lunches in the microwave while he unpacked his perfectly organized bento boxes, which looked so much better than my frozen dinners. One day, I said, looking at his colorful lunch, "I want to try it." He grinned and took out an extra set of chopsticks. "My mom taught me how to cook," he said, handing me an avocado and salmon roll, "although I'm pretty sure she's regretting it now." I quickly stopped believing in her special recipes. This first lunch together turned into daily lunch meetings. We were sitting at a small table by the window exchanging stories about our lives. I told him about my childhood in the suburbs, about my strict but reasonable parents, and about my grandmother, who gave me an apartment before her death. Jacob talked about his work, hobbies, and dreams, but about his family, almost never. After 3 months of dining, he finally asked me out. "Tonight," he said, putting the containers back in his bag, "in a place where there is no microwave and plastic cutlery." I smiled. "I agree." That's how our real story began. We dated for a year, and it was great. Jacob turned out to be caring, funny, attentive. When he suggested living together, it seemed like a natural step. There was a lot of space in my apartment, and it didn't make sense to spend the nights separately anymore. Everything was perfect, except for one thing. I had never met his family. He met mine in the early months, but every time I brought up the subject, he changed the conversation. One evening, after several months of living together, I brought it up again. We were curled up on the couch watching a movie. I paused it. "Jacob, why haven't I met your family yet? Are you ashamed of me?" He sighed, running his fingers through his dark hair. "God, no, Britt, I'm not ashamed of you. I'm ashamed of them." I laughed, sure it was a joke. "Come on, they can't be that bad." "They're like that," his voice was serious. "They're different. They think it's all a joke, even serious things, even tragedies." I raised my eyebrows. "What do you mean?" "Do you want examples?" He straightened up, his jaw tensing. "When I was in high school, my first girlfriend came to dinner with me. Mom served spaghetti, but instead of noodles there were rubber worms. She screamed and threw up at the table. Everyone was laughing, except for me and her. She didn't talk to me anymore." I stared at him, waiting for a joke, but she wasn't there. "Or this," he continued. "I had an important presentation in high school. My brother replaced my notebook with the same one, only full of pornographic drawings. I opened it in front of the class. I was suspended for 2 weeks." I listened to him, and each new story was worse than the last. I was beginning to understand why he was so reluctant to introduce me to them. But I never imagined that I would become their next target very soon. Jacob proposed on Tuesday, nothing special, just the two of us cooking breakfast in our small kitchen. The air was saturated with the sweet aroma of browning pancakes, and the sunlight fell softly on the wooden countertops. I was turning over another pancake when, as if casually, he took a velvet box out of his pocket. "I can't imagine my life without you, Madalna. Will you marry me?" At first, I froze, pressing the spatula to the hot pan. Then she slowly turned around. There was such touching sincerity in his eyes that my heart trembled. Of course, yes." We laughed and hugged right in the kitchen, forgetting about the pancakes that had burned. And then, almost inevitably, the words I had been dreading and waiting for came out. "I guess it's time for you to meet my family." The Machiavelli family's house looked a lot more harmless than I expected after all Jacob's stories. Charming two-story colonial building with white shutters covered with ivy. The lawn in front of the house was neatly trimmed, and the flower beds were iridescent with purple irises and white daisies. For a moment, It even seemed to me that I was worried for nothing. The door opened before we even reached the porch. Oh, finally. A petite woman with Jacob's brown eyes and a wide smile rushed to me, hugging me so tightly that I involuntarily held my breath. We were dying to meet the woman who stole our Jacob's heart. Mom, Jacob muttered, rubbing his temple, but she just waved him away. Mr. Machiavelli stood behind her, tall, with a noble streak of gray at his temples, and composed as if carved out of stone. Next to him is Gaston, Jacob's older brother. His light brown hair was in disarray, and his lips were curled into a lazy grin. There was already something mocking in his gaze. The first hour passed surprisingly calmly. We were sitting in a cozy living room with worn flower-patterned sofas, chatting sweetly. They asked me about my job, my childhood, and my first meeting with Jacob. The jokes that sometimes slipped through seemed harmless, more warm than malicious. I began to relax, almost convinced that Jacob was exaggerating for nothing. But he was sitting next to me, his jaw clenched tightly, as if he was waiting for a blow. "I'll get us some tea," Mrs. Machiavelli announced with a beaming smile. "Madalena dear, how do you take yours?" "Just a little milk, please." She returned with a tray on which delicate porcelain cups were steaming. I took mine, took a long drink, and immediately regretted it. It was like a firestorm had exploded in my mouth. Salt, pepper, so much pepper it felt like I'd swallowed a whole chili pod. I coughed, feeling tears sting my eyes. I bent over, trying to spit the tea back into the cup, but it was too late. My throat was constricted and my face was burning. The Machiavellians burst out laughing. "Welcome to the family," Gaston hooted, slapping his knee. "You better get used to it, we love our little jokes." "That's how we show love," Mr. Machiavelli added, wiping away tears of laughter. I don't remember how I ended up in the kitchen. Just icy water from the tap and my own sobs mixed with ragged breathing. I found a glass, filled it with ice water, and drank, gulping greedily, until the burning subsided. My nose stung, my mascara was running, and my makeup was smudged. In the mirror above the sink, a black, streaked panda face stared back at me. Jacob's angry whisper came from the living room. "It's not funny." "Oh, relax," Gaston drawled lazily. "It's just a joke." When I returned to the living room, Jacob jumped to his feet. His face was flushed. "You're all assholes. That's why I didn't want to bring her here." He grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the door. In the car, he apologized over and over again. I hugged him, pressing my cheek against his shoulder. "It's okay, truth." But I was seething with anger. Not because of the salt in the tea, not because of the bullying, and because of this icy indifference with which they inflicted pain under the guise of good-natured fun. We drove home in silence. With every kilometer that passed, I got the feeling that Jacob wasn't exaggerating. He warned me. But a wedding is not just about love. These are two families intertwined with each other, regardless of whether they are suitable for each other or not. For weeks we debated whether to invite them to the wedding. I was afraid that the whole day would turn into a circus, that every minute would be riddled with their poisonous jokes. "Actually, we should invite them," Jacob said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table, carefully signing the invitations. I looked at him over the stack of cream-colored envelopes, gritting my teeth. "Are you serious?" "They're still my parents," he replied softly, looking at the piece of paper in front of him but not seeing it. "As much as I hate their antics, if they're not at the wedding, I'll regret it later." I crossed my arms over my chest. "Aren't you afraid that they will ruin this day?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. "I'm afraid, but I have to at least try." The next day, he called them, putting them on speaker so I could hear. "Mom, Dad," his voice was stern, controlled. "You can come to the wedding, but I need your word, no pranks. This is the most important day of our lives, not a circus." There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Machiavelli's lilting voice came over the speaker. "Of course, dear, we'll be good, I promise." I didn't believe a word of it. The wedding day started off perfectly. The ceremony was magical. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of the ancient chapel, flooding us with a soft glow. The white silk of my dress flowed across the marble floor, and Jacob held my hand so tightly, as if he was afraid I would disappear. Everything went smoothly during the reception. Even Jacob's family, to my surprise, behaved themselves, although I noticed that Jacob was watching them like a hawk, ready to snap at any moment. Then it's time to cut the cake. Our cake was magnificent, four-tiered, covered with snow-white fudge with delicate sugar flowers falling down the sides. But when they took him out into the hall, I felt strangely uneasy. Candles were burning on the cake. Lighted candles. It wasn't part of our plan. I turned to Jacob, intending to say so, but before I could say a word, there was a loud bang. Then another one, and more. The cake exploded. Pieces of sponge cake, cream and glaze flew in all directions. Most of this mess landed on me. For a moment, deafening silence hung in the hall. Then I heard a familiar laugh. Machiavelli. They were literally falling on top of each other, holding their bellies, pointing at me. "Your face," Gaston choked with laughter. "Oh my God, your face." I stood there, stunned, feeling the sticky sweetness trickle down my wedding dress, and suddenly I couldn't stand it. Tears welled up of their own accord. Through my blurred vision, I saw Jacob's face contort with rage. "Get out," he yelled at his family. "Get out of my wedding." Mrs. Machiavelli looked puzzled. "Oh, don't be so sensitive, darling. Everyone loves a good wedding prank." Jacob did not answer. Instead, he gestured to the guards we had thoughtfully hired. They led the laughing Machiavellians out of the hall. My mother rushed to me with napkins, desperately trying to wipe the cream off my face. The bridesmaids surrounded me, as if shielding me from the remnants of this nightmare. Even Jacob's aunt, Clara, whom I had only met that day, came over to help, casting disgusted glances after the departing relatives. "I can't believe they're my brother's family," she muttered, carefully removing a piece of fudge from my hair. "This is a wedding, for God's sake, not a frat party." Somehow we saved the rest of the party. Our friends and my family rallied around us, turning this nightmare into something to laugh at. Someone found a spare cake. Our wedding planner was obviously prepared for such situations. After changing into a spare dress, we were even able to take some decent photos. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm after this wedding disaster. Jacob and I enjoyed quiet evenings in my grandmother's old apartment. We converted the guest room into a home office, intending to use it like this for several years before possibly turning it into a nursery. But the plans changed just a year after the wedding. I found out I was pregnant. Jacob was overjoyed. He picked me up in his arms and spun me around the kitchen, but immediately put me on the floor when I turned green from the sudden change of position. We decided to keep it a secret for the first few months, telling only our parents. But news, as you know, spreads fast. I was already 7 months pregnant when Jacob's phone rang one evening. He looked at the screen, and I immediately realized who was calling. "Your mom?" I asked. He nodded, pursing his lips tightly. "They know." I felt my stomach turn cold. "About what?" "About the baby." I instinctively put my hands on my swollen stomach, as if to protect it. "No kidding around the baby," I said firmly, crossing my arms over my chest. "Absolutely none." Jacob nodded in agreement, before answering the phone. When Concetta was born, she was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, warm brown eyes, just like Jacob's. She squeezed my finger with her small hands, and at that moment it seemed to me that the world had shrunk to the size of this ward, this baby in my arms. We managed to keep Machiavelli away for the first 2 months, but their persistence wore us down like dripping water, and in the end, I gave in. One visit, I told Jacob while he was making arrangements with them on the phone. Only in our apartment. We are monitoring the situation, and if there's even a hint of a joke, they're gone forever. They came on Sunday afternoon. I watched them like a hawk, looking for the slightest signs of mischief, but to my surprise, they were normal. Mrs. Machiavelli gently held Concetta, rocking her in her arms. There were tears in her eyes. "She's beautiful," she whispered, stroking the tiny hand. Mr. Machiavelli silently took out an old photo album, showing us yellowed photographs. His father holding baby Jacob in his arms, vague black and white family history shots. This visit was the first in a series of others. Every few weeks they came with gifts, soft toys, picture books, and behaved themselves. But I've never completely relaxed in their presence. I rejected all dinner invitations, remembering the pepper tea incident all too well. One day, when Jacob was changing Concetta's diaper, Mrs. Machiavelli casually mentioned, "Oh, by the way, Gaston got married last month." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. Really? Yes, such a small ceremony, right in the courthouse. His Daphne refused to arrange a real wedding. She shook her head, clearly disapproving. I don't understand why. I clenched my teeth to keep from answering. Really, don't you understand why? Instead, I just nodded, replaying the memories of my own ruined wedding dress and exploding cake in my head. It wasn't hard for me to guess why Daphne chose a quiet, inconspicuous ceremony. I was even a little jealous of her. In my imagination, I clearly saw how their conversation went. Gaston, trying to convince his fiancée of the harmlessness of his family, and Daphne, who already knows the truth. She must have heard the stories about our wedding, or maybe she already had her own experience of Machiavelli's harmless jokes. Anyway, she's a smart girl. She just didn't give them a chance to prove themselves. Life has a habit of collapsing at the most unexpected moment. One rainy Tuesday morning, Jacob kissed Concetta before school. He kissed me before work. And he walked out of our door for the last time. A drunk driver ran a red light at 9:17 a.m. By 9:20, I became a widow. Concetta didn't understand. She was only 7 years old, too young to really understand the meaning of the words, never coming back. When I told her that Dad was dead, she looked at me with clear eyes and asked, "Will he be home for dinner?" And every time she asked about it again, my heart was torn apart. The days before the funeral passed as if in a thick fog. My mother took over the organization, choosing flowers, ordering wreaths, calling relatives, and I just sat on the couch, holding Concetta in my arms. I couldn't cry anymore. It was as if all the pain, all the rage, all the sorrow had been drained out of me, leaving only emptiness. Machiavelli came to the funeral. Gaston and Daphne were with them. I barely noticed them until it was the turn of the eulogies. I did the talking first. I talked about Jacob as a husband and father, about his kindness, about his gentle humor, about how he taught Concetta how to ride a bike a month ago, running alongside her and catching her when she lost her balance. My words flowed calmly, evenly, almost distantly. And then Mr. Machiavelli stood up. He cleared his throat and said, "Jacob has always loved a good joke." My fingers curled into a fist. I remember when he was 5 years old, and we convinced him that his teddy bear had come to life and eaten all his Halloween candies. I felt my stomach clench. But he continued. Or the time we switched his shampoo for glue. My God, his hair was standing on end back then. It was such a laugh. There was an ominous silence in the hall. Even Gaston shifted from one foot to the other, not knowing where to put himself. I didn't hear the end of his speech. My blood was pounding in my temples. I looked at them, at these people who called themselves his family, but couldn't utter a single word about who he really was. Just joking. Only the memories of how they humiliated him. Mrs. Machiavelli interjected with a laugh. Do you remember that time in college when we sent him a fake letter about enrolling in medical school? He was so worried then, and he hadn't even applied. His face was priceless. The church was silent. No one was laughing. I looked around. The faces of the people around reflected a mixture of disbelief and indirect embarrassment. Concetta, who was standing next to me, tightened her grip on my hand. I felt something snap inside of me. Mr. Machiavelli continued to grin, probably already thinking over the final joke he was going to use to mark the day. But I couldn't keep quiet anymore. After the service, when people began to disperse to the place where the memorial dinner was to be held, I went to Machiavelli. My voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut glass. How dare you, I hissed. How dare you turn my husband's funeral into a joke? Mrs. Machiavelli reached for my hand. Oh, Madalena, Jacob would appreciate that. He always loved our humor. I jerked my hand away, as if I'd been burned. No, he was patient, and what you're doing is cruel and reckless. I took a deep breath, bracing myself before saying the last words. I don't want to see any of you anymore. You are no longer welcome in our lives. Concetta and I are done with you. But we are a family, Mrs. Machiavelli protested, her voice shaking with genuine confusion. No, I replied firmly. The family does not humiliate each other. Family doesn't spoil weddings, and he certainly doesn't make plays at funerals. I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there, still wondering what they had done wrong. They never understood. And they will never understand. 5 years flew by in a blur. Concetta has grown up. From a grieving 7-year-old girl, she turned into a thoughtful 12-year-old teenager with kind eyes and the gentle spirit of a father. I tried my best to be both a mother and a father to her, trying to fill the gaping hole left by Jacob in our lives. I've only heard fragmentary information about Machiavelli through acquaintances. Gaston was now the father of 2 boys. I've seen pictures of them on social media, little replicas of my father with the same sly smile. But I always scrolled through the page quickly, keeping this chapter of our lives securely closed. Concetta sometimes asked about them, especially during the holidays or when her friends talked about their grandparents. I never told her about the exploding wedding cake or how her grandparents turned her father's funeral into a farce. She had enough complicated feelings about losing her dad without that. And then the phone rang. 3 days before Christmas. Madalena, Mrs. Machiavelli's voice was older, softer, and somehow tired. Please don't hang up. I almost did it. But Concetta was sitting next to me on the couch, bent over her homework. She raised her head, listening intently. We miss Concetta, Mrs. Machiavelli continued. And for you, please, would you like to spend Christmas with us? The whole family will be there, Gaston, Daphne, their boys. We will be glad to see you both. I already opened my mouth to say a firm no. But Concetta, already guessing who was calling, began nodding vigorously, her eyes pleading. I sighed. Absolutely no practical jokes, I said slowly, emphasizing each word. No kidding, no tricks, nothing like that, just an ordinary Christmas dinner. We promise, Mrs. Machiavelli replied immediately. We swear by Jacob's memory, Mr. Machiavelli added. They must have turned on the speakerphone. I froze. Whether it was a reference to Jacob. either my daughter's hopeful face. But I caught myself saying, "Okay, we'll be there." After hanging up, I picked up my wallet. "Let's go get some presents." Concetta squealed with delight, grabbed her jacket, and ran out into the hallway. And I was standing in the middle of the living room, still not sure if I had done the right thing. A few hours later, we were returning home, loaded with packages. Concetta beamed as she told us what gifts we had chosen for Gaston's boys, and how much she was looking forward to meeting the cousins she had never met. "Will they be happy to see me?" "What is it?" she asked, clutching a box of toy cars. "Of course," I said, although I wasn't sure. Somewhere deep inside, there was anxiety. What if they lied? What if this is some kind of joke again? But I looked at Concetta, her excited face, her eyes full of hope. If we were doing it, we were doing it right. We've selected top-notch kitchen appliances for Machiavelli, the latest tablet for Gaston and Daphne, and the trendiest toys of the season for their boys. Concetta, wrapping the gifts in shiny paper, asked, "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa bought me something nice?" I forced a smile. "Of course, honey." I hoped I wasn't lying. They had 5 years to think about it. Concetta was immersed in picking out ribbons and postcards, sorting through snowflakes and reindeer, and I watched her beaming face and prayed that I wouldn't make the terrible mistake of letting Machiavelli back into our lives. Machiavelli's house looked exactly as I remembered it. Twinkling garlands hung from the roof, and a magnificent wreath of pine branches hung on the door. Warm light streamed from the windows. Concetta tightened her grip on my hand as we walked down the path, carrying armfuls of carefully wrapped presents. When we entered, we were greeted by Gaston and his family. His wife Daphne helped us take off our coats, giving me a warm, almost apologetic smile. Their boys, Leon and Guido, stood timidly behind their parents, looking at us curiously. The gift distribution started promisingly. Concetta and I handed over our boxes, and the reaction seemed sincere. Mrs. Machiavelli shed tears of joy as she looked at the new coffee maker. Mr. Machiavelli turned on his tablet with genuine delight. The boys' faces lit up when they tore open the wrapper and saw the game consoles. And then it was our turn. Mrs. Machiavelli, beaming, handed Concetta a gift. "Merry Christmas, darling," she said, smiling. Mr. Machiavelli handed me the same box. Concetta's fingers trembled as she unwrapped the first gift from her grandparents in 5 years. I'll never forget the look on her face. Inside was a plastic toy imitating dog poop, and a few cheap knickknacks from a discount shipping container. Concetta's lips trembled, and the laughter started instantly. Mr. Machiavelli and Gaston literally howled. Even the boys joined in, pointing fingers at Concetta's stunned face. "Oh my God, look at them," Gaston gasped through his laughter. "Their expressions are priceless." I gritted my teeth and unwrapped my gift. Expired candies. A few more things with markdown stickers. I raised my head, feeling an icy anger rising inside. "Where are the real gifts?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Mrs. Machiavelli wiped her tears of laughter. "What are you talking about? These are the gifts." I looked at their faces. "You haven't seen your granddaughter in 5 years, and give her fake dog poo." They looked at each other, confused, as if they didn't understand what the problem was. "That's ridiculous," Mr. Machiavelli insisted. "Oh, Madalena, learn to understand jokes." I saw a tear roll down Concetta's cheek. And something in me snapped. I didn't say a word. I just got up, walked over to the boys, and took their consoles. "I'm sorry," I said, "but they're going back to the store." Mom, Leon and Guido squealed, grabbing their boxes. But I was already on my way to Gaston and Daphne, picking up my tablet and other gifts. Madalna, this is cruel, protested Mrs. Machiavelli. I turned to her. Cruel, my voice was icy. You gave a 12-year-old girl who lost her father plastic dog poo for Christmas, and you're calling me cruel. It was just a joke, Gaston began. I cut him off. We're leaving. I turned to Concetta. Put on your coat. She quickly jumped to her feet, wiping away a tear. As I reached for our jackets, Mrs. Machiavelli spoke again. That's no reason to react like that. I whirled around. No, then tell me, what would Jacob say? I paused, looking straight into her confused eyes. Do you think he would have laughed? She opened her mouth, but couldn't find anything to say. We're done, I said, pulling on my coat. This time it's final. Concetta was already at the door, clutching the empty postcards she was going to sign for them. I took her hand, and we went out into the cold winter night. Behind us, in the warm living room, the Machiavellians were still sitting in complete silence, probably wondering again what they had done wrong. The drive home was quiet. Concetta was staring out the window, clutching an empty gift bag. I'm sorry, honey, I finally said, breaking the tense silence. I really thought they had changed. It's okay, Mom, she replied softly. Then, after a pause, she added, Can we watch Christmas movies and make hot chocolate when we get home? We're going to have our own Christmas, just us. And that's exactly what we did. The rest of the holiday was spent in cozy pajamas, under a warm blanket, with cups of hot chocolate in their hands. We watched old Christmas movies, laughed, baked cinnamon cookies, and tried our best to forget about Machiavelli and their idea of humor. The day after Christmas, I was scrolling through my Facebook feed when I came across Gaston's post. Terrible Christmas. Yesterday, my daughter-in-law showed her true colors by taking Christmas presents from my crying children. Some people just don't understand family traditions and humor. My poor boys are heartbroken. Christmas is ruined. Comments started pouring in immediately. How terrible. What kind of person takes gifts from children? She sounds toxic. My hands were shaking as I typed my answer. Let me tell you what really happened on Christmas Day. Do you want to talk about cruelty? Let's talk about your family traditions. After 5 years of lack of communication, your parents gave their only granddaughter, a 12-year-old girl who lost her father, a toy that imitates dog feces. They gave me items from the dumpster that still had the markdown stickers on them. And then they laughed at our pain. But that's not new, is it? Let me tell you about our wedding day, when your father and brother arranged for our wedding cake to explode in my face. Or about my husband's funeral, when his parents thought it appropriate to turn the eulogy into a joke about how they played him as a child. Do you want to talk about toxic family traditions? Let's talk. I clicked publish and closed the phone. After a few minutes, the situation began to change. Other relatives began to interfere. Oh my God, do you remember cousin Sarah's graduation? They replaced her diploma with a mock certificate during the ceremony. They put laxatives in the punch at my birthday party. They ruined my son's bar mitzvah with their prank tour. I scrolled down the page, and Gaston's post was flooded with confessions. All these years, I thought I was the only one who saw something cruel in their jokes, but now it became obvious that Machiavelli was not the only one who offended me. Daphne, Gaston's wife, even liked a few comments. The first phone call came that evening. Gaston. Madalna, his voice sounded cautious. I never thought of it that way. Reading all these stories, God, we were really terrible, weren't we? Yes, I answered without hesitation. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Machiavelli called. We never meant to offend anyone, Mrs. Machiavelli said, her voice trembling. We thought everyone was laughing with us, Mr. Machiavelli added, that it's all just a joke, a fun pastime. We've always been like this, Mrs. Machiavelli continued. It's just how we show love. But maybe we were showing it wrong, Mr. Machiavelli finished quietly. I took a deep breath. You have to understand that your practical jokes are not funny. They are cruel, they hurt people, they hurt your granddaughter. We're seeing it now, whispered Mrs. Machiavelli. Will you ever be able to forgive us? I closed my eyes. I don't know, she answered honestly. I'm glad that you finally understand how your behavior affected others, but I can't just forget everything that happened. 2 days later, a delivery truck showed up at our doorstep. Inside the large package was an iPhone, the one Concetta had dreamed of, and a sincere letter of apology from her grandparents. I picked up my phone, read the note, and then sent Gaston's boys their game consoles. With a short note. Now everyone should have a real Christmas. It's been 6 months. There was a fragile, tentative truce between us now. We sometimes met for coffee or lunch in neutral places. Machiavelli really tried to change. No more practical jokes. No more cruel jokes. Concetta sometimes had video conversations with her cousins. And for the first time, I saw genuine remorse in the eyes of Mr. and Mrs. Machiavelli. Jacob would be proud of this progress. I think he always hoped that his family would understand one day. Maybe they finally understood. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.